I hope that the audience is going to be swept up in the very uncanny nature of feeling like they were truly in the world of apes, and that the most mysterious thing about it is that they could relate to the internal lives of what was going on inside of those characters, that through the experience that the audience themselves become apes, that they feel for the plight of the apes, and that they feel the thrill of the apes, and that they actually also feel the terror of being in the midst of these animals. And so that it should be hopefully a very, very exciting experience, because it's both emotional and terrifying and thrilling.
Dawn of the Planet of the Apes shouldn't have worked. The year is 2011. You're an executive at 20th Century Fox. The Rupert Wyatt-directed Rise of the Planet of the Apes just released in theaters, and surprise, surprise, everyone is on board. People loved this movie. Even people who expected to be disappointed loved this movie. They loved the effects, they loved the references, they loved Caesar, and they'd grown emotionally attached to his story of self-worth and revolution. The point of the matter is that after this, Planet of the Apes was back, and people wanted more. And with a $481 million box office gross, you are happy to oblige. So you fast track a sequel. You jack up the budget from $93 million to $170 million, and lucky for you, director Rupert Wyatt alongside screenwriters Rick Jaffa and Amanda Silver are glad to return to make it. And crucially, Andy Serkis has agreed to come back to play the role of Caesar. It seems like everything is set to go perfectly, and you'll be able to make that 2014 release date a mere 3 years after the release of the first film. But then things start to go wrong. Rupert Wyatt, only months before filming is set to begin, comes up to you and is like,
this is awkward. I was just looking at our schedule, and I just don't think this movie and me are gonna be compatible, so, see ya.
Damn it! What are you supposed to do now? You gotta hire a new director, and this guy wants to what? Practically rewrite the entire script you already had written? He wants to shoot in these extreme weather conditions on location? On location? What does that even mean? Oh god, it's all falling apart. Everything is falling apart. Why did you even take this job in the first place? It was because this is what your father wanted. He wanted you to follow in his footsteps, and you figured that maybe if you did that, maybe he'd finally be proud of you. Maybe he'd finally shake your hand, or hug you even. Maybe he'd look at you and his eyes wouldn't be filled with contempt. But then what happens? He dies in a car crash the day after you get hired, and now you're stuck. You can't leave this nightmare even though the only reason you submitted to it is gone. You're stuck waiting for a hug that will never come because your father is a corpse, and now the apes will reveal you for the fraud you always were. Oh god. Oh god. Oh, wait, hold on. Let me check my notes here real quick. Oh wait, it says here that Dawn of the Planet of the Apes is actually fucking incredible and manages to exceed the original in almost every possible way. Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, with all the odds stacked against it, somehow went on to become the fan-favorite film of the franchise and one of, if not the best science fiction blockbuster ever made, in my opinion. It was a film that took its predecessor as a foundation to create something more complex, more emotional, more beautiful than anything the Apes franchise had ever even dared attempt. If Rise set the standard for how to revive a franchise, Dawn sets the standard for how to evolve one. It is arguably the most ambitious Apes film to date, with gigantic sets, a large cast filled with multifaceted characters, and a story that confronts one of the biggest questions a film possibly can. What are we fighting for? And that ambition, that complexity, that emotion is mostly thanks to one man. Just months before filming was set to begin on Dawn, Rupert Wyatt, director of Rise of the Planet of the Apes, chose to bow out of the production. His rationale was that with a strict release date less than 3 years after the first movie's release, he just didn't think he had enough time to make a film living up to his standard of quality. Fair. As such, Fox had to scramble to grab somebody, anybody, to make this thing. And then, in a stroke of luck, they somehow found the perfect director to helm it.
So with this particular project, it was the script, but it was the sort of history and all the baggage around it too that it sort of comes with. And then I met Matt Reeves, and I liked him very much and thought he had an interesting take on it, putting, I think, more focus on the human element.
Matt Reeves truly seeks the emotional centre of every point in a very, very ambitious project. And he's such a hard worker, but in the big machinery of it all, in the huge behemoth production that this is, he's managed to get into the centre of the drama. It's always about the reality and the emotionality of the scene.
What's really admirable about Matt is that he came in with this unbelievable enthusiasm and maintained it. You know, he's this very tenacious director, he's a very tenacious worker. And so he had a vision, especially in terms of Caesar and his character and how that translated into Andy's performance.
You know, Matt, he's a real, he's a character-driven, drama-driven director, I think. And, we discussed a lot of, the world that Dawn exists in, and where it picks up from the last one and what makes this one, worth doing and interesting and fun and, and challenging.
It's about grappling with the different sides of ourselves and having to come to terms with the animal in all of us and to find a way to reconcile the parts of our nature and the struggle to do that.
I think I've gone long enough on this channel without expressing my undying love for this man, so here we go. There are 5 things you need to know about Matt Reeves to understand why he was the absolute perfect man to take on this job. Number 1, Reeves only tells stories he believes in. Reeves loves stories, experiencing them just as much as telling them.
That was the thing, because making a movie as a kid, it was never like, okay, well, do you want to be a writer, or would you like to edit, or this or that? I was like, I just love filmmaking, and so I love, all of it.
One only need listen to him talk in interviews either about his inspirations or the film he himself is working on to notice his wonderfully infectious love for what he's talking about. And within that, Reeves doesn't tell a story unless he really cares about telling it and knows that he can bring something to it that no one else could. When Reeves was tapped to remake the Swedish vampire film Let the Right One In, he initially declined. He loved the Swedish film and he didn't believe he could do anything new to it that warranted a remake. However, once he read the original book, he felt a deeply personal connection to it.
And then I called them up the next day. I said, you shouldn't remake this movie because it's fantastic.
Yeah.
But I was really in love with that story. And they said, well, we don't have the rights anyway. We're pursuing the rights. They didn't get the rights. Hammer got the rights. But it so stuck with me. And then I decided to read the novel. And then when I read the novel, there was even more detail. It was clearly like Lindquist's childhood. And I so related to it. I grew up, basically we're around the same age. And I grew up at the same time that he was growing up in Sweden in the 80s. I grew up in the United States.
Right.
And I started thinking, well, maybe there's a way to not step on the toes of this film, but to sort of find a way to recontextualize it to stuff that sort of I connected to from my childhood.
He wanted to readapt the book, not remake the movie. And whether or not you think he actually succeeded in bringing a new perspective to the story, the fact is that he didn't want to tell it unless he had a personal reason to do so, going on not only to direct the film, but also to pen its screenplay. And that was the kind of belief he had when deciding to work on Dawn. I had never done a tentpole movie, but one thing that I could tell from the outside and from the experience and from watching the movie, these movies are so huge, they take up your life in such a grand way, and I've also seen so many of them where the kind of filmmaking point of view sort of gets sucked into what almost looks like a kind of generic comedieism. And I had such admiration for those guys who had been able to make something that felt like they had real points of view on this kind of scale. And I felt like the only way I would ever be able to do that is if I had kind of an emotional connection to the story. Reeves cares about stories, too much to make one that he doesn't 100% care about or believe in. And that brings us to our next point, number 2, Reeves refuses to compromise his vision. Reeves doesn't care nearly as much about the money as he does about the integrity of the story. In fact, he was determined not to ever make a studio blockbuster because when he was a child, Stuart Little 2 killed his mother in an alleyway, and he could never forget or forgive that horrible crime. Obviously. He also just wasn't willing to fight a big studio to preserve his original vision, but that's not as important. If you want an actual quote from Reeves himself, here's what he had to say about the time they approached him to make Dawn.
And they showed me the outline, and I said, oh, I see. Well, it wasn't his outline. It was something that they were trying to figure out what to do. And I said, oh, I don't think it's for me, but I do love this franchise, and good luck. And they said, no, wait, what would you do? And I said, well, I don't want to tell you that because you're going to give me some Faustian bargain. You're going to say, do 37% of what you want and the rest are what we want, and the whole big showdown at Candlestick Park. And I was like,
This is a big budget blockbuster from one of the biggest names in the industry. I'm sure Reeves would have been very well compensated compared to his lesser budget films in the past. But despite that, he still said no, because he didn't think Fox would let him tell the story he wanted to tell. And if you watched my Rise video, you probably know why saying no to that is fully within the spirit of this trilogy. But luckily for both Reeves and us, Fox told him that as long as he could make the film within the same time frame White had been expected to, he could basically do whatever he wanted. And I said, that makes it really hard because now you're not giving me the reason I needed to say no, which means I have to say yes. Number 3, he looks like a dork. Look at him, he's wearing a little bow tie with a sweater. Look at that hat. This is the only kind of person I trust to make my monkey movie. Number 4, he loves Planet of the Apes. This is a man who loves the Apes franchise, possibly more than anyone else who could have made this movie.
Did you see Rise and then you wanted to do the next one, or did the studio come
well,
to
it's
you?
interesting that they did come to me, but I did see Rise, and I've been a fan of Planet of the Apes since I was a kid.
Yeah.
And I was obsessed. I wanted to be an ape as a child. Like, Planet of the Apes was sort of my Star Wars before Star Wars.
Rise was built from the passion of people who wanted to revive a franchise that was so special to them. To get anyone who felt less enthusiastic about it would have been a big mistake. But somehow, even more than he loved the franchise, number 5, Reeves loved Caesar. He loved the entire movie that he was succeeding, but more than the movie as a whole, he loved its main character. And through this love for the character that brought such heart and soul to Rise, Reeves knew one thing better than anyone else. Dawn had to be about Caesar. These films needed to be the story of Caesar. I felt that what they had pitched me, the outline form, was not Caesar's movie, and I said, to me, the victory of your last film was that it was Andy's and Caesar's movie, and that the most human character in that story was not a human at all, it was an ape. And I thought that was mind-blowing, especially that they had been able to realize the visual effects in such a way that you had that level of emotional identification. And I felt it was the deepest level of emotional identification I'd ever experienced with a CG character. Like, I know all the stuff that Andy had done, but I got very emotional in some scenes, and I thought, wow, that's incredible. How are they doing that? And so I said, you've got to make it Caesar's story. It should start and end on him. It's got to be his movie. That's where the emotional core of this story was. The thing that grounded such a fantastical concept in reality. The thing about Matt Reeves is that it seems that his main goal when making a movie is to put things on the ground level of the action. He wants you to focus entirely on what's happening to the characters, not what's happening around them. The environment needs to be grounded and real enough to keep the fantastical elements from overshadowing the human reality of the story. And part of creating that sense is by making the visual element of the story feel entirely natural. But that part wasn't just Reeves' doing. That would be primarily on the shoulders of production designer James Chinland and cinematographer Michael Saracen. These two were enlisted to create the grounded feel that Reeves wanted inside of a post-apocalyptic San Francisco. Michael Saracen is well known for his insistent use of natural lighting and shadows, and good God, it looks incredible. Every frame of painting indeed. And it all feels natural, real, and narratively and thematically appropriate. The cinematography is built mostly on one key element: overcast skies. What Saracen does here is utilize not the abundance of light, but the lack of it that comes from blocking the light source, the drab grays that come with the persistent threat of a storm and the darkness that lies in bursts of flame. This story isn't about the light, but the shadows, the things we don't pay attention to but that have more influence than we could ever know. It's because of the shadows that these greens seem damp and somber. It's because of the shadows that every scene feels like it could explode into violence at any moment. Those shadows create contrast, create cool blues that feel freezing and warm yellows that feel burning, create moments of quiet pain and explosions of dreaded war. And all of that comes from the natural lighting and grounded cinematography. And the production design is also founded in this kind of grounded realism. How much of this movie do you think is CGI or green screens? Besides the apes. It's gotta be a lot of it, right? Surely they didn't do all of this on location or on giant sets. And you're right, they didn't. They just did most of it. The one part of this film done entirely on a soundstage was the climax, because obvious thing is obvious, but the vast majority of the film is shot either on these massive sets or just as often on location.
It's a combination of sort of a huge scope and scale, but a very definite reality to it. And about 85% of the shoot took place outside, on location.
Pretty much the only thing done digitally besides the apes themselves were backgrounds. This forest, that's in Canada. You could go there if you wanted to, probably. Don't quote me on that, but it's definitely real. And all that rain, that dirt and mud, that's all real too. The apes' home, that was a giant set built in the parking lot of an abandoned Six Flags. The humans' home, they shut down traffic in New Orleans to build this and film on it. And while the apes are digital, once again, they are motion captured. So most of the time, while they aren't technically real, they are based on real movements and expressions from the actors who play them. And even a lot of these stunts that you would think had to be done in a computer, nope, that's the wonder of motion capture. They just strapped a mocap suit onto a stuntman and had them run around as the characters played by other people. Oh, but surely this shot is all CGI. Surely they didn't actually film this practically. Nope, they strapped a camera to a fucking tank with real explosions. And the apes around were actually CGI, but the rest of it was real. This continues the trend of Rise, where we're seeing digital effects on the foundation of practical ones. But the scale of this one is so much greater than the first. Rise was more or less our world, but this is entirely speculative, designed and built completely from scratch. And it takes the story about the conflict between humans and hyper-intelligent apes and somehow makes it feel totally grounded in reality.
To me, the idea of what's exciting about trying to do a movie like that is to let that be the only element of fantasy that's there, so that everything else feel utterly real, and you just sit there watching it as if it actually happened. And that's a very powerful idea. And that's everything we've been trying to do, between what we've been doing with the actors, between what WED is doing, what we've been doing with production design, is to try and take that fantasy and make it not feel like a fantasy at all.
And speaking of the story, let's talk about that. Considering the name of this channel, it might be kind of important. This is the kind of sequel that shows every other sequel how to do it. Everything in this film is built from something found in its predecessor. It's a totally natural evolution from where we last left off. The simian flu, as we saw at the end of the last movie, is spreading uncontrollably, nearly killing off all of humanity. With all of humanity gone, Caesar and his apes are left to build their civilization in peace without human interference, but since humanity is all but wiped out, the remaining humans are desperate to survive and keep their race alive, which eventually leads to a confrontation between the burgeoning civilization of apes and the slowly disintegrating colony of humans, and the movie takes it from there. We get Koba from the last movie, who we've already seen has a bitter hatred towards humans. We get Maurice being Caesar's trusted advisor, which makes sense since Maurice was the first ape that made him proud to be an ape. We see humans who blame apes for the simian flu since they were tied to its creation. We see Caesar growing, raising a family, and becoming the leader he set out to be in Rise. Everything this screenplay does naturally flows from the events of Rise. So, as viewers, we already have a sense of emotional involvement in this story and these characters. We already know the stakes for Caesar and Koba. We already know how the world came to be this way. And it leaves the movie itself to do one thing: tell the story we're here to see. All you need are casual reminders and small details as to where these relationships are currently at. The movie doesn't have to spend obscene amounts of time setting the foundation because the foundation has already been set. All we need are glimpses into where we're at now, and the movie gets to focus on further building character and exploring the emotions of those characters. This exemplary screenplay was written again by Rick Jaffa and Amanda Silver, but there's a third name attached to it that may be even more important: Mark Baumbach. Baumbach is a screenwriter, but he's probably more well known as a script doctor. That means that instead of writing a script from scratch, he would come in when the studio called him to clean up an existing one and make it a little tighter or more well-rounded. From 1998 to present day, he's written/co-written films ranging from Live Free or Die Hard to uncredited work on 50 Shades of Grey and Logan. He also happened to do some uncredited work on Rise as well, in which he added one of the most important details: Caesar drawing his window on his cell wall. It's kind of the symbolic crux of the film, so much so that I'm very surprised it wasn't there until Baumbach put it there. Baumbach was brought in on Dawn to change the original Jaffa Silver script to match Matt Reeves' pitch. We spent about a week together in Matt's office every day, brainstorming, trying to figure out what is the best version of the next iteration of this Caesar saga, and in doing so, we came to like each other's style. we have a different pace of working that complements each other. I tend to go fast and keep moving, and if Matt were left to his own devices, the odds of making that start were pretty slim because he likes to be methodical. It was really collaborative with Matt. He almost functioned as a silent partner for me as a writer. So, Baumbach was writing the movie, but it was based ultimately on the story Reeves wanted to tell. And what story we ended up getting was essentially a post-apocalyptic, ape-centric, Shakespearean-style tragedy. A film about family, power struggles, betrayal, and manipulation. At its core, it's a story of two apes who see themselves as brothers being torn apart by deeply rooted ideological differences, and what that means for their civilization as a whole. And since Jaffa and Silver were still credited as co-writers, I don't actually know exactly how much of Dawn was them and how much was Baumbach, but what I do know is that it was 100% Matt Reeves. Listen, Rupert Wyatt did a great job on Rise. I'm not saying he didn't. I made an entire video on my love for that movie, and I don't want to make it sound like he didn't do a lot of great work on it, but... okay, let me put it like this. It feels like anyone could have made Rise, but only Matt Reeves could have made Dawn. Dawn is built on the foundation of the two things Matt Reeves focuses on the most: emotion and character. One only need look at Reeves' previous two films to understand this: 2008's Cloverfield and 2010's Let Me In. Both of these films had not small but fairly modest budgets compared to Dawn, and they both provide a significant focus on character motivation and emotionality. They both attempt to capture intense and often multifaceted emotional experiences. Cloverfield's ground-level, found-footage take on what is essentially a Godzilla movie tries to capture the very essence of terror and what we hold on to in the midst of it. Let Me In explored the complicated, confusing, and often scary feelings and revelations that come with early adolescence through the lens of vampire mythology. Both of these movies have interesting subtexts and themes aside, Cloverfield being an attempt to capture the terror and uncertainty that enveloped a post-9/11 America, while Let Me In grappled with the philosophical concepts of good and evil. But those subtexts don't exist without the characters. They don't exist without the emotions they feel. These movies don't exist without those things. They are the core. The cinematography, production design, writing, performances, visual effects, and everything else are all expansions of and in service to the emotions of the narrative. And Reeves' insistence on keeping things grounded and real takes what are very fantastical concepts and keeps the focus on the emotions at the center. It's watching a giant monster destroy New York City and focusing on how people on the ground are dealing with it. It's watching an immortal vampire suck the blood of a police detective and focusing on the little boy who chooses to ignore his silent plea for help. To put it simply and concisely, Matt Reeves is an emotional storyteller. His stories thrive on emotion and character. And it was that focus that Reeves brought to this trilogy. Reeves was the perfect man for this job because Rise did something no other ape film had done before. It put character at the forefront. Every ape film before it was all about plot and theme. The characters were mere expansions of that, but Reeves chose to make Caesar the heart of the film. And rather than steer away from that, Reeves decided to take it even further. He wanted to make every character, not just Caesar, complex and flawed and nuanced. He wanted to make the story more morally gray and imprecise. He wanted to put the characters at the center of the narrative and have everything build from that. Reeves brought the characters, and the characters brought the story. Because while Rise put Caesar at the forefront, it was still primarily a plot-driven movie. If you'll remember back in the Rise video, I talked about that film's dedication to a sense of narrative flow, but here in Dawn, that's not nearly as much of a priority. In fact, Reeves will very often break that sense of flow seemingly intentionally because what he loses in a sense of narrative flow, he makes up for in beautifully crafted and emotional character beats. Dawn is slower, more careful, and decided. Reeves wants you to stop and take in the moment, to look into a character's eyes and see exactly what they're feeling and to understand exactly why they're feeling it. He wants you to sit still and get to know these people so that when the plot does ramp up and big things do start to happen, you care on a deeply profound level. These aren't just fictional characters being thrown around for the sake of plot. These are people you know and care about fighting for what they think is best. What Reeves brought to Dawn was a story defined by its characters rather than characters defined by the story. Caesar was the centerpiece of Rise because the plot demanded him to be. Everyone knew where Rise would end up, so the goal was getting us to that point. The decisions of the characters had to facilitate that ending, and it worked, but it created an interesting dilemma for Dawn. Suddenly, people are having to ask, where do you go from there? Does Dawn solidify Planet of the Apes' long history of plot-centric storytelling with big themes at the forefront, or do you take the influence of Caesar and create something more character-centric? Do you explore big ideas, or do you keep things intimate and on the ground level? And Matt Reeves, amazingly, hit the split and did both, using one to do the other. By focusing on character, emotion, motivation, and psychology, the big ideas Planet of the Apes was founded on emerged naturally. The characters aren't created based on the themes they need to reflect. The themes are created based on the decisions of the characters. The decisions are what matter. And all of those decisions are made based on a single moment. The scene starts with this shot slowly coming into focus, almost lazy, unremarkable. It feels like even the movie itself knows this moment is unimportant, just two friends fishing and teasing each other. It's entirely unexceptional. A moment of total calm. Cut to our two ape friends walking through the forest, one teasing the other about their encounter with a bear. They walk together, and in each shot they're overlapping each other, a sort of visual connection between them. They continue to walk forward, still overlapping, still connected. Nothing can separate them until a human being walks into frame, and the two friends' connection is broken as both parties become still. There's an immediate tension as both sides realize what they're looking at. The man is obviously more scared, and despite the fact that the apes pose no obvious threat, he pulls his gun on them. We get this shot here where the two sides are separated by this tree right here, with neither side moving past it. It's this sort of artificial separation between them where not even their weapons quite pass through. The apes take up more of the frame and can be seen quite clearly, giving them a much greater sense of power and solidity, whereas the man takes up much less of the frame and is partially covered by a tree, his presence much weaker, but the important part, his gun, being very present. The shot closes in very, very slowly, only for one of the apes to make a slight movement forward and one shot, one bullet, crossing the threshold, the border, a deadly connection between the two parties. And it changes everything. The entire film is built on the fallout of this moment, when ape meets human, and this entire scene is very much a microcosm of the entire film. A story of division based on the introduction of the unexpected and the artificial borders we create when we first view each other by our differences. Both human and ape in this scenario were just casually walking through, but it was this sudden meeting that created barriers and separation. The entire scene is built on the emotions of the characters, the camaraderie between Ash and Blue Eyes, the calm of a day out fishing, and the tension of unexpected meeting. It's about how unremarkable peace can suddenly turn to tension and violence at the advent of that very human emotion, fear. The story can go anywhere from here. Unlike Rise, this movie doesn't have to end up anywhere specific, so the story is dictated by the choices of the characters in reaction to this moment. Caesar chooses to keep the two civilizations separate. Koba chooses not to trust the humans at all. Malcolm chooses to go back to see the apes despite Caesar's warning, and these decisions don't always line up. Some decisions contradict others and lead to conflict. This is a movie about conflict, about the hatred and desperation that feeds it and the fear that lies beneath it all. It's a movie about how war begins both on the scale of separate civilizations, but also on the scale between father and son, or the rift between brothers. And at the heart of it all are the characters, the humans and the apes who have to make the choices that will decide the fate of them all. These characters define the story's direction and purpose, so if we're going to understand Dawn, we have to focus on them. In Dawn, there are 5 major players, 5 characters who will be the deciding factors between war and peace, and those characters are the human leader Dreyfus, the son of Caesar Blue Eyes, the human ambassadors Malcolm and his family, the brother of Caesar Koba, and the ape leader himself, Caesar. None of these characters are heroes. None of them are villains. And exploring the gray areas these characters reside in, the decisions they make, and the things that define them is the best way to understand not only why Dawn works as a film, but also what it's trying to say through all of this. So, let's start with... Played by Gary Oldman, Dreyfus is ultimately a very small part of the overall story. He has no dialogue with any of the apes and is in very few scenes besides. But god damn it all if they don't make the most of the character while he's there. His and the human colony's main goal in this film is effectively to turn the lights back on. The generators they've been using are drying up, and they need power in order to get humans back to where they used to be. And if they lose what they have, they very well may end up back in a time of chaos, disorder, and darkness. They risk losing all the progress they've made after they've been through hell and back just to make it here. So, when their only chance, a hydroelectric dam, is suddenly found to be deep in ape territory, things become complicated. An unstable alliance is formed, and we'll talk about that alliance later on, but for now, in the interest of keeping things focused on Dreyfus,
there's a specific scene I want to talk about.
A scene that perfectly encapsulates the motives and emotions that drive the character. It starts with a celebration of the colony as the dam has been repaired, and for a blissful period of time, everything looks like it's going to be okay. All the tension and uncertainty is finally going to work out. They don't yet know that this is just the calm before the storm, so they relish in it. I want to note the lighting in this scene. It's made up of warm, light yellows standing in stark contrast with the cold, dark blues of most of the rest of the film. It's a time of warmness and celebration. We then cut to Dreyfus overlooking the scene with a smile on his face. He's alone in what looks like an office illuminated by the golden glow outside. A sharp cut to the inside of his office, and we're back to the cold blues. The warm yellows are only barely making their way inside from the windows. There's a sound of an iPad turning on. He begins swiping through pictures of military time and family lost, and he cries and he laughs, slipping in and out of that nostalgic feeling of the past and the reality of the present. This scene does so much with so little. It's such a small moment. It means nothing for the plot. You could have cut this and the actual plot would have been largely unchanged, but without it, the emotional core of this character gets left on the cutting room floor. He's allowed to take joy in the joy of the people he leads, but he'll never be able to forget what he's lost. His purpose lies solely in the people he now leads and helping them bring the world back to what it used to be, whatever it takes. He's lost everything that's mattered to him. The world he once knew can never be brought back, but for these people, maybe it can be. He has nothing left to fight for except for his people. Dreyfus is built on these small moments of emotion and character. Take this other scene here where, as the apes charge towards the human colony, Dreyfus stops and comforts a terrified young soldier. And then take this moment soon after when Dreyfus looks on in horror at the dead body of that same soldier. Or take this one line long before everything goes to shit where he says point blank,
3 days. You're not back in 3 days. We're going up there and we're going to kill every last one.
In every moment, every action, every spoken word, Dreyfus's priority is his people, no matter what he has to sacrifice for them. Getting power and making everything normal again is all he cares about. If they can do it peacefully, great. If not, that's acceptable. He has one goal and one goal only: protect his people. And he's going to do that, whatever it takes. He doesn't necessarily want to destroy the other side. He doesn't want to hurt the apes, but if it comes to that, then it comes to that. He's not going to put the needs of the apes over the needs of his people. After all, why would he care about the apes who were, in part, connected to the formation of the simian flu that killed his family? Whether it was the flu itself or the resulting chaos, his family died, and the apes are an easy scapegoat. So while he doesn't hold them entirely responsible, why does he need to care about a group who didn't care about him? Coexistence isn't the goal. Surviving is. He's willing to give peaceful resolution a chance, but only a chance. He's too desperate for the survival and well-being of his people to make peace the priority. In this film, Dreyfus plays the role of the desperate leader in desperate times. He's everything a leader needs to be. He's reassuring, assertive, and puts the needs of his people at the forefront, but it doesn't mean he isn't flawed, and it doesn't mean he doesn't play just as much of a role in everything going to hell. He's all too willing to go to war with the apes. In fact, it's his first instinct, I will remind you.
I'm gonna kill every last one.
Yeah.
The only reason he's even willing to give peaceful resolution a shot is because Malcolm convinces him to.
He's so focused on keeping his own people alive that he fails to see the needs of the apes, needs that certainly don't contradict his people's own. And this need causes him to start stockpiling and testing weapons that will eventually vindicate Koba's fear of the humans. Desperate times and a desperate leader make for someone more than willing to fight against anyone that might be in his or his people's way. Someone who will always fight for no one but the us, whatever it takes. And that introduces us to a psychological idea you may have heard of, the us versus them mentality. The concept is not a particularly complex one. It's even in the name. It's us versus them. We tend to take people in the out-group and pose them as the enemies, even if they're not. And we tend to take people in the in-group and pose them as the heroes, even if they're not. We create superficial barriers between us and them in order to enable these mentalities and perpetuate an increasing fear for the them and reverence for the us, creating hostility and conflict over our differences. This Psychology Today article explains two possible reasons why us versus them mentalities come into being. One, we perceive that our group is in direct competition with another, especially over a limited resource. While there is a limited resource in the film, that being the power of the dam, there isn't really a shared need of it between the apes and the humans. The apes don't need this dam, hell, they don't seem to even have tried to understand it. Now, the competition can be merely perceived rather than genuine, which would fit somewhat into Dreyfus's worldview, but it's not enough to really pin the us versus them mentality on this theory. But the second theory is much more fitting for this film. This mentality can arise even without the perception of competition. The mere categorization of people into an us and a them is enough to produce hostilities. Just perceived differences and separation can result in us versus them mentalities that can lead to very genuine conflict and violence with very genuine consequences. And Dreyfus is a victim to this mentality. The apes are the them, his people are the us. The apes are the enemy, the obstacle in his and his people's path. He doesn't view them as equally worthwhile.
They want what we want, to survive. They don't want a war. They're animals! They attacked us!
So while he doesn't want to fight them or kill them outright, he already has an internal bias that predisposes him to that outcome. He doesn't want that to happen, but he's willing to let it go there because he doesn't care about the apes. He only cares about his people. He only cares about us, not them. These us versus them mentalities are paramount in creating real conflict, and Dreyfus, in his desperation and black and white view of the world, is very much a victim to that. He's lost everything that ever mattered to him, and he's desperate not to lose the only purpose he now has, even willing to die for it when the apes actually do become a very real enemy. He's willing to do anything for the us. But what happens when you don't have much to fight for except yourself? What happens when you're so young that your ignorance vastly outweighs your experience and you don't even know it? What happens when you're manipulated into thinking your worldview is your own? Remember the scene I talked about before? When ape meets human? Yeah, that one. Well, that's Blue Eyes with his best friend, Ash. Like Dreyfus, Blue Eyes also plays a very small role in the film, perhaps even smaller because he does very little in the way of progressing the actual plot, but what he represents as the son of Caesar is far more vast. Blue Eyes is young and impulsive. He's rebellious and emotional. He's confused and ignorant. He cares for his family, he loves his father, and he's attached to his friends, but as most teenagers are, they haven't quite figured out who exactly to trust or listen to yet, or even if they should be trusting or listening to anyone else at all. And in Dawn, Blue Eyes has two primary influences that whisper in his ear: Caesar and Koba. They have two distinct relationships with Blue Eyes that can be summed up in two lines, one said by Caesar and one said by Koba. After Blue Eyes runs into a bear despite clear signs one is nearby, these are the things Caesar and Koba tell him. Caesar is Blue Eyes' father. He's trying to teach him about the world and how to navigate it, trying to make sure he knows when he's done wrong and the ways to do it right. Think before you act is actually some really good advice for Blue Eyes, but it's advice he fails to follow because it means that he failed. But Koba is like the cool uncle who is always wearing a Giants jersey and smokes cigarettes in the house even when your mom specifically told him not to. He's maybe not the best influence, but he's going to be the last person to punish or chastise you. Blue Eyes needs to learn from this experience. He needs to learn that his impulsiveness should be reined in, but Koba basically tells him that he's done nothing wrong. Perhaps it's what he wanted to hear, and perhaps Caesar could have been more reassuring, but when left on its own, it does nothing but validate Blue Eyes' actions. Scars make you strong is not what Blue Eyes needs to hear in this particular context. It makes it sound like scars are not a lesson to be learned from, they're the goal. Blue Eyes is young and inexperienced. He doesn't know much outside of his immediate surroundings. His primary method of judgment is by evaluating how something makes him feel. And Caesar made him feel like he made a mistake. He made him feel like he's not doing things right. He has and he isn't, but the idea of it gnaws at him. It's a necessary lesson, just one Blue Eyes doesn't want to hear. But Koba makes him feel strong. Koba makes him feel brave. Koba makes him feel like he's right. Blue Eyes isn't particularly important on his own. He doesn't actively betray his father. He doesn't even play a key role in Koba's eventual coup, but what he represents is much larger and deeply significant. Blue Eyes plays the role of the manipulated youth. Koba's ideologies of strength, power, and ruthlessness are a lot easier to digest and live by than Caesar's ideologies of patience, caution, and peace. We'll go into specifics on those ideologies later, but for now, what's important is the way those ideologies make Blue Eyes and subsequently the youth he represents feel. Patience and caution feel slow and uncertain. They leave events up to the whims of chance and the very real possibility of loss. As we've already gone over, if Malcolm hadn't been there, Dreyfus would have launched a full-scale assault on the Apes that Caesar wouldn't have been ready for. And as we saw, the humans have already hurt Apes before, Ash having been shot and almost killed. But the thing is, Koba's ideologies play to the ego. They make you feel strong and superior. They feel more certain and assuring of victory. In chaotic and unpredictable times, it's nice to feel strong and in control. It feels better to take action than to sit and wait. And when you're pairing unpredictable times with the natural insecurities of youth, it makes it all the easier for someone like Koba to manipulate Blue Eyes into his way of thinking. The us versus them mentality is simple. It's an easy, self-affirming way to look at the world and the people in it. It disregards any complex nuance and encourages you to look at any differing group as the enemy. Take the scene where Koba shoots Caesar later on. When he blames it on the humans, it comes to Blue Eyes as a contradiction. These are the very same humans who saved his mother's life with their medicine. Why would they then proceed to kill his father? But as his home burns and his father is seemingly murdered, who picks Blue Eyes up? Koba. Who gives Blue Eyes a gun? Koba. Who makes Blue Eyes feel strong? Koba. In the midst of chaos and contradiction, Koba's worldview is simple and effective. It's a clear image when everything seems blurred. And Blue Eyes is open to the concept because while Caesar never taught him that humans were evil like Koba believes, he also never taught him that they weren't. But it doesn't take him long to realize what's actually happening. The battle scene between humans and apes that follows Caesar's murder stands in stark contrast to the last time we saw a human-ape confrontation at the end of Rise. In Rise, the battle was a triumphant showcase of apes' strength and worth. It was the cathartic expression of an oppressed group standing up for the basic right of freedom. But here, it's chaotic and scary, just as chaotic and uncertain as the events that led the apes to this point in the first place, possibly more. Look again at the lighting in this scene. It's those same warm yellows from before, but this time, they don't come off as warm. They're hot, burning, searing.
What was once a warm, happy glow is now the color of fear and destruction. Because while Koba's ideas promised certainty and simplicity and warmness, those things weren't for Koba to promise.
Blue Eyes is forced to see exactly where Koba is leading them to. Violence war and death. And Blue Eyes was complicit in letting this happen. He didn't stand up when he had the chance, and he openly supported what Koba was saying and decried Caesar's lack of action. Blue Eyes let this happen. There's a moment right after this scene where Blue Eyes mimics something Caesar did at the beginning of the movie. It's a symbol of restraint, but now it's too late. Blue Eyes had the chance at every turn to use that restraint and to stand up to Koba, but now it means nothing. And when someone does stand up, Rocket's son and Blue Eyes' best friend Ash, Koba shows Blue Eyes and everyone else exactly what it means to dissent. He took the ape who had been shot by humans, the one who had more reason than most other apes to want to kill humans but chose not to, and he killed him. And Blue Eyes let that happen. Eventually, this all leads to Blue Eyes finding his father alive, and what he learns cements every doubt.
No. Not human. Koba.
Koba wasn't ever fighting with apes in mind. He was just fighting to kill humans, no matter how many apes were killed in the process, and Blue Eyes let that happen. While it's not necessarily Blue Eyes' fault that Koba manipulated him, the role he plays needs to be recognized and learned from. Blue Eyes is a perspective of innocence and naivete. He is our view into the depths of complicity's consequences. His role might be small, but without him, we don't get to really understand what it means to see all this happen and know that we did nothing to stop it. Blue Eyes illustrates how important it really is to understand when we're wrong, when we've made a mistake, or when there's a lesson that needs to be learned, because ignoring all of that only allows those who rule by fear and hatred to manipulate the ego and rise to power. When we refuse to learn, when we give into the fear of uncertainty in desperate times, we not only allow people like Koba to take over, we actively endorse it, knowingly or not. And while Blue Eyes can't blame himself for Koba's manipulation, he has to take responsibility for what he allowed to happen. A responsibility he takes when he chooses to aid Caesar in reclaiming his place as leader, despite knowing what Koba would do to him if he found out. Because he saw the mistake he'd made, and he chose to right his wrong. There's no shame in failing or making a mistake. There's no shame in scars, but there is shame in refusing to learn from them. But while both Dreyfus and Blue Eyes weren't actively fighting for peace and were mostly reactionary characters, there are characters in this story whose main goal was peace and coexistence.
I didn't know you had a daughter.
Yeah.
I'm really sorry.
Now I have you and your dad.
This is what this family brings to this movie. Here in this story of hyperintelligent apes in conflict with a nearly extinct human race, we have something as simple and relatable as a stepson and stepmom trying to connect over a shared sense of loss. Not only does this match up with Matt Reeves' style of grounded, character-driven drama in the midst of fantastical plots, but it's also that sort of hopeful family dynamic that breaks up the drama of the story in a way nothing else really does. While these are the human ambassadors to the ape civilization and they are all actively seeking coexistence and peace, the role they really play in this story is much simpler. They are representative of what may be lost. It's those moments of connection that are at stake in this film, and while these stakes are present throughout everything, they are most concentrated here in this family. Every character among them is defined by empathy and their ability to form and maintain connections in spite of their circumstances. Malcolm creates a friendship with Caesar during his time with him. He maintains a loving relationship with Ellie where they both hold each other up in harsh and difficult times. Ellie then forms a bond with Alexander, who needs a mother who will understand and listen to him after having gone most of his life without one. And Alexander then uses that love and empathy shown to him to connect with Maurice, who shows an interest in Alexander's comics. When Dreyfus is desperately fighting to maintain a sense of purpose, and when Blue Eyes is being manipulated into us versus them mentalities, we have Malcolm becoming friends with Caesar. We have Ellie saving Cornelia's life without question. We have Alexander sharing human culture with Maurice. We have people who choose not to embrace those us versus them mentalities and who are the best hope in the film of a peaceful outcome. We have a family who recognizes more than anyone else that this doesn't have to be apes or humans, them or us. It can be both. These are just the normal people who want nothing more than to get out of this alive and, more importantly, together. In any conflict, these people exist. These people caught in the crossfire who just want to protect what they love.
I know everyone's depending on you.
I don't care about that. I don't care about any of that. I care about him.
All Malcolm wants is to protect his son, and that means making peace with the apes. Dreyfus might want to protect his people above all else, even himself, but that does not mean it is a selfless act. Dreyfus needs purpose. Dreyfus needs something to fight for, so he fights for his people. It's not his people's well-being that he cares about, it's their very existence. He needs them. But for Malcolm, his son's safety is obviously important to him, but it's just as much about the world his son will be forced to inhabit. Will it be one dominated by war and violence, or one where apes and humans can coexist in peace? That's the source of peace in the end. It's the selflessness and love that a father has for his son. But there are some forces that have none of that. Some forces that act through nothing but fear. If this film is about what leads to conflict, Koba is the inciter, the driver, the one whose main goal above all else is to create conflict. But why? Why do that? Why would you so willingly throw everything away, embrace destruction, chaos, and death? Why would you take such a good life with a leader you view as a brother and right hand and forgo it all for a needless war? Well, let's start at the beginning, shall we? We actually met Koba in Rise. In that film, he was an experienced lab ape, scars all over his body, and already rather intelligent before he received a direct dose of the ALZ-113. All Koba ever saw of humans was the evil they could do, the torture they could inflict, the pain they created, and he had ultimately become resigned to it. There was nothing he could do, and he wasn't yet intelligent enough to understand that he could fight back. Until, of course, Caesar came and gave him not only his freedom, but also the opportunity to kill one of his tormentors, Stephen Jacobs. Koba was allowed, finally, to find a family and a home. A world separate from the torture and oppression he found with humans. He was suddenly able to have freedom and control over his own existence. Caesar gave that to him. But now, the humans are back. And everything Koba found with Caesar and the apes, the family he found, is in jeopardy. He's only ever seen humans as the them. They are never to be trusted by any ape at any time. For Koba, doing anything less than slaughtering the humans outright is a mistake, because it gives them the opportunity to attack and bring them all back down to the oppressed group they used to be. All he knows of human work are the scars on his body.
Human. What? Human. What? Human. What? Human. What?
The role that Koba plays in this story is that of the fearful radical. Because while Koba is defined by his hatred of humans, that hatred is defined by the very real fear of what humans have done to him and what they might do if they gain power over him again. the control he has over his own life, the power he was given by Caesar, he's afraid that all of that might be taken away. Perhaps that power might even be taken away by Caesar himself. Let's take this scene here. Koba has found that the humans are stockpiling weapons, and though they don't necessarily plan to use them, Koba doesn't know that and certainly isn't willing to entertain the possibility. He goes back to the ape colony to find that Caesar has gone out to the dam to help the humans repower it, something that Koba has convinced himself will seal the apes' fate. After all, the humans are currently in a weakened state. Why give them the power to do more? These humans have already been antagonistic towards the apes, one human in particular who not only shot Ash, but who also nearly shot Caesar's son. And Caesar is helping them?
Caesar love humans more than apes. More than your sons.
I think Koba totally believes that. He's making vocal his actual fears, the fear that the ape he looks to as a friend, as a brother, is either blind to the danger the humans pose or is actively betraying his very family. And when Caesar proceeds to actually beat Koba because of this accusation, Koba feels vindicated. Look at this face. Look at the fear and the shock at what just happened. As far as Koba was concerned, he just called Caesar out, and Caesar treated him like the villain. Caesar takes away his control, his power in the community, the trust of his family. The thing is, Koba isn't afraid for apes. He's afraid for himself. He needs to feel in control. He needs power after going most of his life without it. He can't go back to what he was now that he knows the alternative. He can't risk that. So when that power is seemingly threatened, when it feels like that control is being ripped away from him, he makes a choice. Between power and family, control and brotherhood, fear and love, he chooses power, control, fear, and hatred. He can't let that power be taken away, even if it means killing the ape he views as a brother. Koba's us versus them mentality is born from a limited experience. It's not just that the humans are different from him. It's not that they look different. It's not that they sound different. It's not Dreyfus's mentality. It's not Blue Eyes'. It's something stronger than either of those. It's a legitimate, desperate fear of a group who he's only known to scar, torture, and take advantage of those like him. That's not the kind of hatred that can be simply overcome. That's not the kind of fear that can be wished away by logic. Koba's hatred is one that cannot be easily broken because in some ways, it's almost justified. The scars on his body tell a wholly different story from the ones others are trying to tell him now. Koba's hatred and the fear it was founded on is not something that can be taught or learned. It's something that has to come naturally from within the depths of the heart. It's not that Koba learned hate from humans, it's that humans are the ones he hates. But that thinking, that Koba learned his hatred from humans, is exactly the thinking that made Koba so dangerous in the first place. We don't want to believe that the fearful radical, the one who would tear it all down, is on our side, within our family, but not believing that Koba could have the inherent capacity to hate humans was the mistake that brought the apes and the humans to war. A mistake that would cost everything. A mistake made by one character.
What I thought was exciting about this idea, which was that you would be going a step further toward an ape civilization, was taking that character who was sort of a revolutionary and watch as he became a leader, and a leader really of a group of apes that are all part of a family, so that you could see all the different aspects of Caesar that made you emotional in the first film, and that would hopefully only take you deeper and deeper into that in Dawn, and see what he was like as a father, see what he's like as a leader, see how he will lead in difficult times. It's one thing to be a revolutionary, it's another thing to have sort of a difficult moral dilemma that you have to grapple with.
Caesar freed the apes and became their leader, but this is a completely different situation. This is much more complicated. This isn't just fighting back against oppression, this is trying to put aside differences in order to make a better world for everyone. But that's not easy. Caesar's goal isn't coexistence with humans, it's the protection of his apes. It's all about making sure his family is safe. Because as much as he wouldn't want to admit it, Caesar views them as inherently more worthwhile. There's this moment near the beginning of the film where Caesar is talking to Maurice about whether or not they think humans are still around, and this exchange occurs. Caesar refuses to believe that apes could do what the humans have done, that in some way the apes are all the good of humanity and none of the bad. That though they may at times disagree with one another, they would never hurt each other the way humans have been known to do. Caesar may not be actively opposed to humans, but he does view them as fundamentally different and ultimately inferior. They're more capable of hatred, of fear. Caesar doesn't help them because they're in need of help, but because they are a potential threat to his world that need to be treated with caution. Even if not malicious, they are still the them to his us. The fact is, he doesn't care about the humans. He only cares about his people. He only cares about us, not them. And that is Caesar's unrecognized but fatal flaw. He views the ape community as some sort of egalitarian utopia where nothing could ever go wrong except for the intervention of outside forces, forces he doesn't think even exist anymore. He's allowed to simply disregard his own bias because as far as he knows, that bias is irrelevant. It's against people that aren't around anymore. Look at the lighting of the ape's home. The blues aren't frigid and indifferent, they're cool and calm. This is a place of peace and equality, but when the humans come back, there is a danger, however slim, of that world falling apart, and Caesar is forced to confront that bias, forced to question what he's willing to do to protect his people, and he makes a fateful error in not realizing where the real danger lied. Caesar's role in this film is that of the flawed king, and his story is centered around the slow degradation of his relationship with Koba. At first, he trusts Koba totally. He trusts him to be the scout to the human colony. He lets Koba run free despite knowing full well what Koba had been through with humans. But as the film goes on and Caesar begins to see more and more of what Koba really is, that trust begins to degrade. That trust, that brotherly bond formed from the shared desire for freedom, slips away. But he makes yet another fateful error. He continues to let Koba run free. He lets Koba plot against him. He ignores what Koba has said, what Koba obviously thinks, what Koba is capable of doing, because Caesar refuses to believe that Koba could do that. He just learned hatred from humans. It's not that strong. There's no way that Koba would... Look at his face. See that shock, that sadness. Even Caesar just watched his friend, his brother, an ape, try to kill him. He let that happen. He let Koba get that far. Caesar failed.
I chose to trust him because he is ape.
And while recovering from that gunshot inflicted on him by an ape, having been saved instead by humans, Caesar stays in his childhood home. The home where a human being raised him as his own. It's the world he left behind. The people he left behind. At the end of the last movie, Caesar chose to embrace his identity as an ape, and that's a good thing. But to do it, he had to recognize that human beings could be his enemy. And in that, he forgot that it was a human being who taught him sign language. It was a human being who taught him to trust. It was a human being who raised and loved him.
Home. Yes. This is your home. Your home.
He left that man behind. He chose to believe that his species was somehow better, and by doing so, not only betrayed the man who raised him, but the apes he swore to protect. Caesar failed. That's what we need to realize here. All of this was on Caesar's shoulders. It was his actions that were going to decide how this all played out. He failed to teach Blue Eyes that humans weren't evil. He failed to reach out to Dreyfus directly. He failed to stop Koba even when it was obvious what he was willing to do. Caesar failed.
I always think ape better than human. I see now how much like them we are.
We often want to believe that we are on the right side of things, that we are the good guys and everyone who thinks differently are the bad. That's what us versus them is. It's failing to realize the humanity in the other, but it's also failing to recognize the flaws of your own. Because if one of your own can fail, that means you can too. And that is fear. And the only way to face that fear is to face your own failure. And Caesar's failure is the brother who shot him. Dawn of the Planet of the Apes is primarily the story of two apes, two friends, two brothers, Caesar and Koba. It's a movie about an ape striving for peace, forced to face his own bias, and an ape clinging onto power out of fear that his newfound freedom will be taken away. Everything is built on that. Every moment. Every decision. It all leads back to this. So, of course, that's how it has to end. On the top of an unfinished skyscraper, a symbol of humanity's potential cut short, they face each other. They stare each other down, these brothers, and then they fight. They fight because they will never agree. They fight because they know they cannot coexist. They fight because in the end, it's us versus them. The fight doesn't feel heavily choreographed or planned. It feels brutal and messy and angry. It's every emotion this fight embodies. It's a civilization brought to war by fear and hatred and desperation. It's the hope for a peaceful future of coexistence dashed against the stones. It's apes that were once brothers divided by pain and scars and human work. And down below we find two people who once trusted each other, built something together, Malcolm and Dreyfus, at just as much of a crossroads between hope and fear. And when Dreyfus chooses fear, he triggers the charges they've set up, killing himself out of the fear that the apes will otherwise survive. Fire belches out towards the apes above. Apes are falling, construction is crumbling, it's all devolved into chaos and destruction, and in the ruins, we see exactly what the two brothers want. While Caesar immediately begins helping the apes who are suffering, Koba ignores them in favor of continuing the fight. He's gone too far. He knows that if he gives up now, Caesar will never be able to forgive him. He will be locked away in a cage. His freedom will be gone. He can't let this be taken away from him. He can't. He picks up a gun. He starts shooting. He has no regard for the apes that get caught in the crossfire. There's no pretense. There's no hiding, no manipulation. This is what Koba is. On display for everyone to see. Scared and desperate. This was never about apes. This was never about family, even if he thought that it was. This was about him, his hatred, his fear. And Caesar has no choice but to attack. Caesar watches Koba hang, the ape he trusted like a brother. Koba tells him the rule that he created.
Ape. Not kill.
The basis of his entire society. He thinks he knows that Caesar would never break that rule. Caesar looks out at the apes, the dead and the bloodied, his family that he allowed Koba to kill and hurt and bring to war because he didn't take the chance to stop him when he could have.
You are not ape.
Caesar ends it. But the damage has already been done. There's no going back from what Koba has done. Caesar and the rest of the apes descend to the ground where Malcolm meets them, and he and Caesar have one last exchange.
I thought we had a chance. I did too.
And in those words, we find the tragedy of Dawn. These conflicts, these wars, they've come before, and they'll come again. It's inevitable. These roles, no matter how much we know of them, will always be filled. There will always be a Blue Eyes, or a Dreyfus, or a Caesar, or a Koba, because these things are ingrained into the human condition, and we are all so, unfortunately, human. Even the ones we trust to lead us. Even when we have the chance for peace, we can only delay the inevitable, because the powers and desires and faults of the few will forever outweigh the needs of the many. There will always be fear, desperation, hatred, bias, us versus them. We cannot look past the artificial barriers we create. We will only ever pass them with weapons and fear. Nothing lasts forever. One way or another, everything comes to an end, whether it's entire civilizations or just the bond between brothers. It will never last as long as we want it to. The things we thought were warm will burn us, but we cannot live in fear of those moments being taken away, because it's those moments of peace and love, those moments of family and light, those are the moments we must cherish while we have them, because while that peace may not last forever, neither too will war or pain. Even if those things will not last, they're worth fighting for, fighting to get back to, because those moments will come again if we push towards them and fight for them. And that's a decision we have to make. Dawn of the Planet of the Apes is a tragedy filled with hope. Hope that we can recognize our faults, learn from our mistakes, and fight for a better tomorrow. There's hope that a family can be born from the ashes of a storm. There's hope that a father and son can reconcile. There's hope that even though a war is to begin, that war will someday end. There's even hope that a movie that had no chance can still become one of the most powerful films of the last 10 years. There is a reason to weather the storm. At the end, we close in on the face of Caesar. The eyes of a leader worn by struggle and conflict. At the beginning, we saw these same eyes, shadowed and narrowed, covered in a cold blue, but here, they're bright and wide open to what's to come, pensive to the coming war. They know more than they ever wished to know. They are tired and strong. They are sad. But somehow, despite all of that, they still feel warm.
On the one front, it's a giant war movie. It's filled with action and battles. But in the foreground, it's really about Caesar's war within his heart and the struggle for his soul. Will he lose any sense of, for lack of a better phrase, humanity?